Seeing as I've spent the last 13 years playing games from the Metroid series, I think I've acquired enough information from the franchise as a whole to be able to rank the games from worst to best. So today I will do exactly that. Before we begin though, there's a few things to get out of the way. Number one, these are obviously only my opinions, so if I order the games in a manner that you wouldn't, please feel free to let me know what you'd order them in the comments down below. Secondly, I obviously won't be including Metroid Prime 4 since we know nothing about it yet. And thirdly, there's technically 14 official Metroid games, but I will not be including the Metroid Prime trilogy since it is simply a compilation of the first 3 Prime games. However, I will be including another Metroid Fusion remake, or AM2R, since even though it's a fan game, it is wholly unique compared to the other fan-made Metroid games. So while the video title does say top 14 Metroid games, one of them isn't an official game. So with all that out of the way, let's begin and start counting down ZDS's top 14 favorite Metroid games. This entry shouldn't be much of a surprise, since it is the only Metroid game that has nothing to do with the others. It's literally just pinball. And while I do like pinball, there's really nothing else to say about it. So since pinball obviously has to be the last spot, I'll start instead with Metroid Prime Federation Force. In all honesty, until writing the script for this video, I never even touched this game. And I think that the dislike bar of the reveal trailer should be proof enough as to why. Metroid Prime Federation Force was a game given to a starving franchise that absolutely nobody wanted. The premise of the game is okay, I guess. It's set somewhere between Prime 1 and 2, where the Galactic Federation are trying to defeat the space pirates with another scheme, with occasional cameos, for lack of a better word, of Samus. The game is meant to be played with 4 players, as a lot of the game takes a lot longer when you play it solo. As such, I didn't even get much past the first part of the game. I've seen plenty of the gameplay and reviews of the game from other YouTubers, and it looks and plays just fine. It's mostly just that the timing of this game completely killed it on arrival. This game will unfortunately forever go down as the most pointless game to ever come out of the Metroid series. And sadly, that puts it at the bottom of my list, and pretty much gives me next to nothing to talk about with it. So let's move on. When I first got my hands on a Nintendo DS back in 2007 or so, I was mostly looking forward to playing Pokemon. But around the same time, when I was shown the Metroid series for the first time, I had heard rumors of a Metroid game for the system. Since I knew no one who'd actually heard of the game, let alone play it, I was really anticipating a great time. A Metroid Prime game on the go? Fuck yeah, sign me up! Then when I finally got my hands on it and started playing it, I quickly realized that this would not be a fun game for me. The game centers around Samus intercepting a signal from the Olympic Cluster, and rumors of this ultimate power. Samus is contracted by the Galactic Federation to investigate and hopefully retrieve it for the sake of the galaxy, so no one else can get their hands on it. But soon after landing on one of the planets, she finds out that other hunters from across the galaxy have also received the signal, and are after the ultimate power themselves. So a rather simple plot, and the gameplay is at least mostly like Metroid Prime. 3D perspective, different weapons stored from hunters, puzzle solving, missiles, morphball, it works, right? Well, yeah, but there was one thing that kept me from completing the game, even today. Why would that be? The reason? Simply put, the controls. I believe I've complained about this before, but I can't for the life of me stand the touchscreen controls in Prime Hunters, and they frankly turned my hands into frickin' pretzels, cramping up so bad that they made the game unplayable. I retired it to the back of my collection, only pulling it out occasionally. After some time, however, I decided one last time to give it a proper shot on an emulator, hoping that it would improve my experience by customizing the control scheme. It helped, but only enough for me to get to the lava planet, before I continued to die to one of the hunters, and continued getting frustrated with the narrowness of ledges I had to traverse in Morphball mode. These things combined together and basically made me never want to touch the game again. Maybe someday when I actually care enough, or I'm just that bored I'll finish it. But honestly, without proper controls, this game is basically unplayable for me. Looking back at some of Samus's earliest outings, going all the way back to the beginning of the series, I came across the original Metroid from my copy of Metroid Prime. It was an unlockable extra feature if you connected Metroid Fusion to your GameCube through the Game Boy Advance link cable. Since I had Fusion around the same time, I decided to give it a shot. And when I did, I found out about old school 80s jank extremely quickly. To go back to the start of the series from playing what's considered one of the best games in the series was definitely difficult. Perhaps a bit too difficult. The original Metroid starts off without any text, any dialogue, any substance really, sort of a common trait for games in the 80s. It just throws you right in, and as soon as you start after getting the Morph Ball, you go to the right, and if you're not careful, you can die immediately in just the first couple of screens. Because for some reason, and this goes for the entire game, Samus only starts with 30 health units. And this is regardless of how many energy tanks that you've acquired later in the adventure. I don't quite understand why this design element was implemented, but then again, I know very little about how gaming worked during the 80s in general. But with my previous experience with Metroid Fusion under my belt, before I played the original Metroid, I thought that it would play rather comparably. God, was I mistaken. I didn't know that the things like the wall jumps weren't even added until Super Metroid, so I felt myself constantly fighting the urge to jump off walls to get to higher areas. Along with that was simply how confusing the world layout was. Everything looked basically the same, and I know now that that was a limitation of the NES rather than an intentional design choice, but again, going from Prime and Fusion back to the original was jarring. So jarring, in fact, that I still have yet to beat the game, and in all honesty, I don't ever plan to. Metroid for the NES is just too difficult for me to have much fun with anyway, but it is at least a good start to the series. Unfortunately, its ability to entertain me doesn't quite put it any higher on this list. Predictably, following my dislike of the original Metroid for the NES, I honestly didn't have any high hopes for Metroid 2 Return of Samus. And when I finally got my hands on a copy of the game through the 3DS's eShop and started playing, I was thoroughly unimpressed. Despite the footage I'm showing right now on screen, which was due to a color mod that I downloaded, I knew that the game would be in black and white due to the Game Boy's original limitations. But because of this, the problems I had with the original game were only accentuated. Despite how linear the game is, I got lost extremely easily. Now, from a plot perspective, however, Metroid 2 is one of the most important games in the series. After the defeat of Mother Brain in the original Metroid, Samus is contracted by the Galactic Federation to go to the Metroid's home planet SR-388 to eliminate every last one of them to protect the galaxy from further abuse of their species. Really simple plot in all honesty, but one that had huge ramifications for the remainder of the series. And it's because of the story's importance, along with the remake, that puts Metroid 2 above Metroid NES for me, despite the fact that I also haven't beaten this game to this day either. Alright, now that all of the quote-unquote bad Metroid games are out of the way, we can finally get into the good stuff. Now, I love all of the rest of the games in the series to one extent or another, so deciding precise order is a bit tricky. And I know this lowest pick will definitely make quite a few Metroid veterans a bit upset. But I have to unfortunately put Metroid Zero Mission at number 9. Now, hear me out, because I do have my reasons for putting it this low. I do still love the game, but of all the good Metroid games, it is the one I like the least. Now, plot-wise, it's obviously the same as Metroid 1, since it's a remake, of course, but gameplay-wise, it's an entirely different beast. Implementing a ton of the gameplay fixes from both Super and Fusion, Zero Mission is a vastly better experience than the original Metroid. To start off, the controls are refined and extremely smooth. It feels great moving around Zebes with Samus, and she doesn't feel the least bit stiff or unresponsive. Many of her weapons from Fusion and Super come back here as well, such as the Speed Booster, Space Jump, and Super Missiles. All power-ups that weren't in the original. So all in all, Zero Mission is a complete improvement from its predecessor. So what puts it this low on the list? Simply put, the damn stinking mission after you beat Mother Brain. I know for narrative purposes that this section is extremely good and important to the story of the series, but it plays like ass. And honestly, it's all about personal preference here. I hate sneaking missions. I've never once played a game with a sneaking mission that I actually enjoy. I'm the kind of player that revels in blasting through hordes of enemy opposition, shredding through bad guys, and getting stronger along the way. Sneaking missions, on the other hand, serve only to break the pace, ruin my enjoyment, and create this feeling of a slow-ass slog through a game I was having fun blasting through just hours earlier. And lastly, the endgame item hunt kinda ticks me off. Having to go across the entire map once again to gather the remaining power-ups is just exhausting. And on many occasions, I've gotten all the way to the end, only to realize I missed one damn expansion, and then I have to comb over the whole world again looking for it. This is something that doesn't happen to me in any other Metroid game but this one. So that's why it's my least favorite of the games I actually like. Oh, and the whole Mecha Ridley getting 3 times stronger if you collect 100% of the items is fucking cheap, and I hate it. When I was first exposed to the Metroid series, around 2009, the most recent game up to that point was Metroid Prime 3. So when I had found out, after I started enjoying the games, that a new Metroid game was on the horizon, you can bet your ass that I got excited. Of course, the guy who introduced me to the series got the game, since I didn't have a Wii at the time, and when he finally gave me his, and I got a chance to play it, I was completely taken for a loop. Many Metroid fans have lambasted this game for over a decade, saying that it ruined Metroid forever, and that it would be a permanent stain on the series' reputation. While I can't agree on that fully, I do get where people are coming from. However, my issues are much less gameplay-centered and more story-centered. I know I'm not the minority on this, but I absolutely fucking hate how they portrayed Samus in this game. They showed her as being a tragic character with a brooding backstory, but it came off more as the story of some depressed anime MC rather than the calm and collected bounty hunter we all know and love. This is, of course, the first, and at this time only, time that Samus has actually spoken. And while the actress who did her voice certainly didn't do a terrible job, a lot of issues came from the dialogue itself. A lot of it sounds like it was a direct note-for-note translation from the original Japanese script without any localization, which is very noticeable whenever she monologues, which she does all the damn time. Good God, Samus talks too much in this game. It's almost as if the developers were so upset that Samus didn't talk in any game before that they tried to vastly overcompensate with Metroid Other M. And there's of course the scene with Ridley, but I'm not going to talk about that since we all know what happens. Now, I don't want this video to turn into a rant about Other M's story, so let's just talk about the gameplay. Overall, the gameplay is actually rather solid. The dual perspectives the game introduced created a very neat method of observing the game from both a third and first person perspective. Granted, however, the implementation of the pointer of the Wiimote to actually change perspectives was pretty clumsy, and certainly not intuitive at first. And I had my fair share of deaths due to being unable to switch perspectives quickly enough before I got sniped. The game overall, however, is very challenging, much more so than even Prime 2 in my opinion. A lot of the challenges in the games comes from the fact that many enemies are super freaking aggressive, and won't hesitate to juggle Samus if you're not careful. Add onto that the fact that most enemies take a lot of damage before they go down, far more so than the other 2D Metroid games or even the Prime games. And the fact that you're often locked in a room until all the enemies are dead. Oh, and quick time events? Yeah, Other M is hard. One of the hardest in the series, honestly. But despite the difficulty and the bullshit story, I do find myself coming back to Other M quite a lot. I feel like the game itself got too much hate right off the bat, and didn't get a chance to really shine, which is a shame. Because Behind the Rough is what I think is a damn solid entry worthy of the Metroid series. After playing Prime 1 several times, my friend at the time gave me his copy of Metroid Fusion after browsing through his garage for about a day and a half. When he and I finally found it, I frankly was super stoked. I was really looking forward to trying this game out ever since I heard about it. And after I got back to home the next day, I popped it into my GameCube Game Boy player, and almost immediately caught my ass kicked. Yeah, it's sort of a trend with me with Metroid games, isn't it? But I'm almost always terrible at them when I first boot them up, no matter how much prior experience I have with the series. And Fusion was honestly the start of it. To just briefly cover the story before I move on, Metroid Fusion starts off with an animated text narration, telling about how Samus was contracted by the GF once again, this time to go to SR-388, this time with a research team to make sure that all the Metroids were truly gone. In the process, she attacks and kills a life form that possesses something called an X-Parasite. This parasite infects Samus, and after leaving the planet, she loses consciousness and crashes her ship into an asteroid field. After her escape pod is recovered, GF scientists have it removed the infected parts of her power suit and inject her with Metroid DNA saved from the baby to save her life. Once she regains consciousness, she's then tasked with investigating a distress signal from the biological research station where her infected suit parts were transported. From here, after being given a ship equipped with an AICO, which is Artificial Intelligent Commanding Officer, she goes to the station, fighting the X and an evil doppelganger of herself made from her old power suit. Bit of a complicated plot, especially for a Game Boy game, but an interesting one that goes into the repercussions of what happened after Samus eliminated the Metroids. The dynamic of her trying to keep away from the SAX also gives a neat sense of tension or dread as you travel to the research station. The plot also directly bleeds into the gameplay. Due to Samus being saved from the X with the Metroid vaccine, she has now become immune to the X herself, and can use defeated X to heal herself and recover her lost abilities. This, however, has also given her a primary weakness to the Ice Beam, one of her most powerful abilities. This makes for some surprisingly memorable boss battles as well, each boss giving her back one of her iconic abilities, and many brand new ones, or ones that have had improvements added onto them, such as the Charge Beam now being its own separate weapon, rather than just allowing her to charge up her arm cannon. This game doesn't have a damn sneaking mission like Zero Mission, but that's another plus for me. Metroid Fusion is a Metroid game I can replay anytime, anywhere, never getting tired of it, and I personally doubt that I ever will. Now, I've gone on at length of my various issues and love for the different aspects of the 2D Metroid games. As such, it might surprise you for me to say that Super Metroid is not my favorite. Super Metroid is, however, on an objective level, one of the most important video games of all time. Not even just for the Metroid series, but for video gaming as a whole. The plot of the game is as follows. After destroying the last of the Metroids on SR-388, Samus takes the newly hatched baby Metroid to the Galactic Federation to see if they can study its genetics for the benefit of the galaxy. However, almost immediately after dropping it off, the Ceres station is attacked by Ridley and the gang of the space pirates. After a brief encounter with Ridley, which results in the baby Metroid being stolen, Samus lands on her old home planet of Zebes to hunt down Ridley and retrieve the baby back from his grasp. A rather simple plot, but much like Metroid 2, its story implications are massive and span across the entire series. Gameplay-wise, Super Metroid is the pinnacle of 2D Metroid action. It pretty much defined the genre for the remainder of the entire series, and every Metroid game, 2D-wise anyway, that came out after this would simply adapt different aspects of the original Super Metroid's control scheme. The controls are fine-tuned to near perfection, and moving around the world throughout the game feels better and better as you gather more upgrades and explore the depths of Zebes. This game also introduced the famed sequence breaking, which has been an integral part of the series ever since. With sequence breaking, the game becomes incredibly more diverse in its approach. For example, the Wave Beam. The Wave Beam resides in Norfair on top of a high cliff that you can't normally reach. You're supposed to grab the grappling beam in order to reach it, but with some well-placed wall jumps, you can get it right after you've gotten the Varia suit. Techniques like this can be difficult to master, but once you pull them off, they are oh so satisfying. Super Metroid as a whole is still super fun to me, pun intended, to just blaze right through. My current speedrun record is just under 2.5 hours for 100%, which obviously isn't pro-worthy, but still a satisfactory time for me. I love this game, and though I played it after the Prime games, it still has to be one of my favorite Metroid games of all time, and pretty much one of my favorite games of all time. When I first got my Nintendo 3DS back in 2013, around the release of Pokemon X and Y, I was already an established Metroid fanatic. So I was really hoping for a new Metroid game to come to my new console. Sadly, I would have to wait a whole 4 years before Nintendo would finally announce one. And when the game released, I had already pre-ordered it and grabbed it immediately after it came out. I was still living at the homeless shelter at the time, and working night shifts as well, so I didn't get a lot of time to play the game. but I did have this channel to share some of my initial thoughts on the game. And while I wasn't very enthusiastic back then, I can say now that after beating the game about a dozen times, including once on Fusion mode, the hardest difficulty, God help me, that Metroid Samus Returns is a wonderful return for the Metroid series. Having it be announced the same day as the hotly anticipated Metroid Prime 4, which is hopefully and gratefully still in development, may have pushed it to a level of obscurity, however, as Samus Returns didn't even reach 1 million units sold, which is a really big shame, as it's one of the best Metroid games ever in my opinion. The plot is obviously the same as that of the original Return of Samus, so I won't go over it again. However, the gameplay is so different that there is no comparison. This is without a doubt the superior version. They even introduced new gameplay elements, such as the Aeon abilities, and also introduced many of Samus's iconic weapons that were released in the years since the 1991 Game Boy game. The only real criticism I have for the game, however, was its borderline extreme difficulty. The enemies in this game are extremely ferocious, far more vicious even than in the Metroid Prime 2 or in Metroid Other M, and won't hesitate to attack Samus at a moment's notice. This admittedly caught me off guard my very first playthrough, since because of this, you were basically forced to use the counter move in order to safely get by early game. And that took some time to practice. However, once you master it, the game becomes a lot more easy to handle. Nowadays, however, I'll admit that I don't play the game legit anymore. I only play the game with cheats on now, since even for me, the game's difficulty is kind of absurd. All in all, however, Metroid Samus Returns is a highly satisfying romp through SR388, and the best Metroid game to come out of the past decade. Alright, now it's time for the real heavy hitters. These last 4 games are ones I not only can play anytime, but often do. I always take some time out of my schedule to just sit down and play a round or two of these games. And the one we're starting with here is actually not an official game. Another Metroid 2 remake, often just shortened to AM2R by fans, is a fan-made remake of the 1991 Metroid 2 Return of Samus, created by a gentleman named Milton Gosti and his team of artists, music makers, editors, and many others that was made over the course of a 10-year time span. That by far is some fantastic dedication, and I have to give ample credit to their creation. Now, of course, anyone who's a Metroid fan knows that when the game went public back in August of 2017, Nintendo hit Mr. Gosti with a DMCA takedown notice, removing all links to the game at the time. I believe personally that they did this because they didn't want his game to overtake the hype of their own remake. And of course, I have no proof of this though. Regardless, even though Nintendo issued the DMCA, Mr. Gosti and his team still have continued to make improvements to the game, adding randomizer support, allowing you to go through the game with all the power-ups, and even implementing a fusion mode of their own. The love and sheer effort placed into this game is top-notch, and it's the main reason why I place it above Nintendo's remake. However, the other reason is because I just love the way this game controls and plays more than Samus Returns. AM2R has even smoother controls than Super, Fusion, and Zero Mission combined. It has, in my opinion, the best controls of all of the Metroid games, hands down, 2D and 3D. Much like with the other 2D games that followed Super, it also implements many of the power-ups introduced in the series. The Plasma, Wave, and Ice Beam, along with the Spazer, are all here and accounted for, plus Samus's various ballistic weapons like her missiles and bombs. But on top of that, and the great control, AM2R also encourages sequence breaking, something that Samus Returns sadly fumbled on. I also really love the environmental design. The parallax scrollings of the background is very well done, and the way that each major area has its own color scheme, much like Super and Fusion, really adds to the aesthetic of the areas and helps you differentiate between them with just a glance. Add on to that the fantastic map feature that is extremely easy to follow, fun boss battles with a good challenge, and a great atmosphere, mostly complemented by the amazing redone soundtrack, and you've got an excellent recipe for a killer Metroid game. Definitely my favorite 2D Metroid game, even now. Check it out if you haven't already. I'm sure the links are everywhere. Just go ahead, search it for yourself, and get playing this game. Alright, so you guys know what the last 3 games are, obviously. The 3D Prime games are, and have always been, my favorites in the series. And fittingly enough, number 3 goes to Metroid Prime 3. To start off with the plot, this time around, the game's plot is actually rather intricate. After the incidents of the first 2 Prime games, Samus heads for the Galactic Federation ship to recon with Admiral Dane. Once there, we head towards the Admiral's quarters, coming across several speaking NPCs, making a first for the Metroid series. Samus herself, of course, does not speak, which frankly I prefer. I think it was the best fit for her to be the only one without a voice, seeing as she'd always been a very stoic person. Anyways, when she enters to speak with the Admiral, we're introduced to the 3 new bounty hunters right off the bat. Andreda, a female alien with the ability to morph her body into other forms, Gore, a biomechanical cyborg made up of 93% mechanical components and has a very articulate personality. And finally Rundus, an ice user who has a very noble personality. Admiral Dane briefs the hunters that the space pirates implanted a Phazon virus into the ship's Aurora unit. Thankfully, they were able to remove the virus quickly. However, many other of the AUs on other planets are still infected. So Dane asks the hunters to go investigate and deliver the antivirus to them. However, just as you're about to leave, the pirates begin attacking the space station. After clearing through many enemies, you return to your ship and go down to the planet Nori. Once there, you head to stop the pirates from destroying the planet by activating 2 of the 3 generators needed for the space cannon to destroy a meteor heading right for the planet. However, once you and the other hunters get up to the top of the tower to activate the switch, Dark Samus appears, ambushes you, and infects the 4 of you with a Phazon seed. With little consciousness left, Samus activates the cannon, saving Nori. A month passes and Samus wakes up in a room being resuscitated by a GF nurse. Once she comes to, she's informed that the Phazon in her body will enable her to use the Galactic Federation's PED, or Phazon Enhancement Device, giving her the ability to use the Phazon in her body as a potent weapon. With this new equipment, Samus meets with the AU on board, which tells her that the other 3 hunters, who went up to the planets of Brio, Elysia, and the Pirate Homeworld, have all gone MIA. Now it's up to Samus to go to each of these worlds, fix the AU, and investigate what happened to the other hunters. Oh yeah, a much more in-depth plot than all the other Metroid games so far. Though not as much as Other M. And rightfully so, seeing as this was the end of the Phazon trilogy of the Metroid series. One last-ditch effort for Samus to destroy the scourge of the Phazon once and for all. However, the plot may be much bigger, but unfortunately, the gameplay doesn't quite match up with the grander scale. Granted, the game is still incredibly fun, but when compared to its predecessors, it's a slight step down. To start off with, the game being segmented into 4 planets and later an abandoned space station creates a rather large disconnect between the different locations. This disconnect also discourages, or in some cases outright prevents, backtracking or sequence breaking, making a first for the Prime series, and after the first Metroid game in general. Not that there's no way to sequence break at all, but it's far more difficult than the other 2 Prime games, and especially Super and Zero Mission. Nevertheless, the way you acquire new equipment and weapons is still very satisfying. As linear as Prime 3 may be, the way the worlds do connect makes you not miss it so much. Prime 3 also introduces plenty of new weapons to the table, especially revolving around Samus' gunship. Marking the first for the Metroid series, Samus' iconic ship is now finally usable for more than just traveling. Mostly as a method of travel though, but the ship also gets access to its own brand of missiles and its own grappling meter. However, the downside to these new items is that they're dreadfully underutilized. They're mostly used as a means to get through level barriers and lift gigantic items in the overworld that Samus wouldn't be able to do by herself. But the fact that we at least have use of the ship is good enough for me. Finally, the most defining aspect of the game is Hyper Mode. By entering Hyper Mode, Samus can use the Phazon in her body to unleash massive amounts of damage and energy. This mode also comes with 3 upgrades of its own: the Hyper Ball, which releases Phazon lightning out of her body when in Morph Ball mode, the Hyper Missile, which is basically a super missile but charged with Phazon, and finally the Hyper Grapple, which is essentially an augmentation of the grapple voltage, allowing Samus to either drain energy from or force energy into a target, provided they have grapple points on them. Definitely the least utilized and most useless of the power-up in the whole game, frankly. And not worth it being the very last power-up you get. All in all, Hyper Mode does make a lot of the game too easy at points though, since even though it uses up an energy tank in order to use its abilities, it's very easy to replenish that energy with energy pickups from defeated enemies. Still, it is a neat spice to your traditional power-ups, so it isn't all bland. But altogether, with the good and the bad aspects of the game, I will list Metroid Prime 3 Corruption as my third favorite Metroid game of all time. When deciding between my top two favorite Metroid games, it's almost like a mother trying to decide which of her children she likes more. I've been dancing around which one I like more for the entire time I've been playing them. After all, they're both, in my opinion, the pinnacle of Metroid goodness. And much like my opinions on my top two favorite Pokemon, the top two favorite Metroid games do kinda shift here and there every so often. But my number two pick isn't number two because I necessarily like it less than number one, but because I've spent less time mastering it than number one. And obviously, Metroid Prime comes in at my second favorite. Before I begin lavishing this game with love and attention, why not give it a bit of a review? The game starts out when Samus intercepts a distress signal coming from a derelict space vessel in orbit above the planet Talon 4. It turns out that the vessel, called the Orpheon, is a space pirate ship that escaped the destruction of Zebes at the end of the first Metroid game. The vessel was harboring many alien creatures from the planet, as well as a mysterious substance found on Talon 4 below that the space pirates decided to try to use as a power source. This substance, dubbed Phazon, turned out to be an immense source of energy, and as such, the pirates began using it not only on other life forms, but on themselves. As Samus explores the ship, she finds many injured or dead pirates strung across the facility, as well as the bodies of large insect-like creatures and other smaller ones running about. When Samus makes her way to the central reactor core powering the ship, one of the large insectoids, known simply as parasites, crawls down and begins attacking her. After dispatching the monster, it falls into the reactor core, causing a power surge. With limited time to escape, Samus rushes off to her ship, only to spot a cyborg Ridley fly away from the crumbling structure. After an electrical explosion which strips Samus of all of her equipment, she returns to her ship to chase Ridley to the planet below. However, Ridley escapes her grasp and she continues her recon on foot. From this point on, the story becomes only more clear through the various data entries you find across the world. These entries come from the Chozo, who previously inhabited the planet, as well as logs from the space pirates who commandeered it for the purposes of extracting Phazon. The method used to gather this information was a very well implemented solution, utilizing the new first-person perspective to see through Samus' own eyes, and scan objects and creatures to gain information about them. I'll save explaining the rest of the game for an actual review, so let me just get into the things I adore about this game, if you haven't seen any of my previous videos on Metroid Prime before. Firstly, the game is absolutely gorgeous. In my opinion, this game has better graphics than even many Wii U and even a few Switch titles. I am dead serious. The environments are well colored, well textured, and just beautiful to look at. This game is definitely the most well-aged game in Nintendo's library, graphics-wise. On top of that, the soundtrack is fucking fantastic. Many of the songs are remixes of classic themes from Super and the original Metroid, but the new versions do way better justice to those pieces than their original creations. Plus, the original themes are just a glorious listen, emphasizing both the energy and the loneliness of this alien world. Then, of course, there's the main thing that brings me back, the gameplay. Again, I don't want to turn this into a review, so to briefly cover it, I really love the idea of multiple beam weapons and different missile combinations, along with the various different movement systems present in the game, such as the space jump boots and the morph ball augmentations. The main reason the gameplay keeps bringing me back, though, is because of the various different sequence breaking techniques you can use to get items out of order. My favorite, of course, being the video that started this channel, the early space jump boots, which basically allows you to completely skip an entire huge section of backtracking and allow you to continue on the second you get the boost ball. But before I ramble on any further, I just gotta say, Metroid Prime is probably the best the series has to offer. It made the jump to 3D perfectly, and that is a very tricky thing to do. Many other franchises died or were buried trying to make the jump, but Metroid, even after 8 years since the game that preceded it, made that transition excellently. It's the best-selling Metroid game of all time, and for a damn good reason. It's a perfect example of how to make a great game. However, it's still not my favorite Metroid game, even despite all my accolades for it. The isolating atmosphere and dangerous terrain facing Samus on her various outings is basically the hallmark of the entire series. Super Metroid perfectly harnessed this in two dimensions. Fusion emphasized the feelings of dread and fear. Prime emphasized isolation, but also that there was still a peaceful sense to the whole game. So what happens when you take all that peace away completely and put Samus in a brutally hostile planet at war with an evil clone of itself, where the very air itself can kill her in seconds? You get my favorite Metroid game of all time, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. This is it. This is the game that truly made me a die-hard Metroid fan. From the atmosphere to the soundtrack, the bosses, the weapons, this game is what I'd call not only the best Metroid game, but one of the best games that I have ever played. As far as the plot goes, it's kinda Samus' typical MO. She intercepts a distress signal, lands on an alien planet, and begins investigating the cause behind it. However, this time it becomes much more serious. After entering the planet's atmosphere, her ship is brought down by a sudden electrical storm. After exiting her ship, she finds herself inside of an old cave system, seemingly dug out by some sort of intelligent life. Moving through, she comes across the bodies of several Galactic Federation troopers, many of which have become consumed in a black and purple miasma of sorts that reanimate them as living corpses. Undeterred, she continues and comes across the Galactic Federation's landing site. There she finds that the entire squad was killed by a swarm of these dark insect-like creatures. And after moving her way to a temple hovering above the canyons and caves, she's attacked by one of these giant bugs, and upon defeating it, an energy orb bonds to her suit. When she heads up to the top of this temple, she's greeted by a being who calls himself Umos, the last sentinel of the near-extinct Luminoth race. He informs Samus that the planet they're on, Aether, was struck by a meteor some time ago, which split the world into two dimensions, creating two worlds of light and shadow. He further exposits that the Luminoth are on the brink of defeat in a war against the creatures of the Dark World, known as the Ing. He says that the energy of the planet had been stolen by the Ing, and that the last bits of the energy, located in the very same great temple you are now in, were about to be taken as well, until Samus stepped in and killed the Dark One. The energy orb that bonded to her suit is the planet's energy transfer module. With it, Umos explains that she can go to the Dark World, recover the stolen energy, and return it to the temples in the Light World. Having no other options, Umos asks Samus, if not pleads, for her to take on this task. She wordlessly agrees and sets off not only to stop the Ing, but to save the planet and the Luminoth. Oh boy, a really heavy plot this time, huh? Samus not only has to recover her missing equipment stolen by the Ing earlier on, but also stop the Ing themselves and save a dying race and the planet they live on. Samus is facing an enemy that's on such a large scale that she may not even fully understand or comprehend what she's dealing with. The Luminoth's entire species was almost completely wiped out by these creatures, and now it's up to her to save them. This plot is what I think is the major driving force behind the player wanting to complete the game. It gives a surprisingly personal and impactful reason to continue playing, since it's ultimately up to you to save this dying world. Now the plot may be bigger, but that doesn't mean that the gameplay suffers either as a result. The gameplay, almost the same as Prime 1, with some pretty big differences. Not to get into review territory here as well, but to cover a few bullet points. The first thing you'll notice is the improvements to the scan visor. Scannable objects now glow either red, blue, or green instead of having just a single orange or red icon to scan. This makes it much easier to know what you've scanned and what you haven't scanned. Sadly though, there was a small downgrade in the moving abilities of the game. The L jump, present in Metroid Prime 1, has been removed in Prime 2. This was sort of an accidental technique that allowed Samus to get much farther distances strafing when locked onto something, allowing her for more lateral movement. The removal of this makes it a bit harder to avoid some faster enemies, but it's not a deal breaker. One of the more divisive mechanics implemented is that of the first time in the Metroid series, the beam weapons now possess an ammo count. It starts off at a paltry 50 for both beams, but increases in increments of 50 for each ammo expansion you get, topping out at a total of 250 units. This contentious feature gathered some ire from fans, who felt that it was just an unnecessary addition that didn't add anything to the game. My perspective is more of an in-universe explanation. The Light, Dark, and later Annihilator Beam animals were created by the Luminoth in a response to the Ing, and trying to create weapons specifically able to defeat them. Since these were made with what we can assume were limited energy resources, and that Samus' suit was never meant to actually use them, it makes sense that they would have limited ammo. This also adds another aspect to the difficulty this game is famous for, as it makes it so that you have to worry about ammo for both your missiles and your beam weapons, making you more cautious about going gung-ho wild on random things, something I tended to do in Prime 1. But despite some small limitations present with the new ammo systems, you can still fire a single shot by charging the beam even if the ammo is depleted, ensuring you can always get to the various doors without needing to grind for energy. Besides the beams, Prime 2 also manages to include the screw attack into a 3D game. It's primarily used only for jumping over large gaps for either progression or power-ups, but it can still kill most enemies with one hit, just like in the contact hits in the 2D games. It's just not ideal since it's rather inaccurate considering enemies move around a lot. The defining feature of Prime 2 though is the Dark World, a poisonous mirror world to the light of Aether, with a toxic atmosphere and dangerous monsters. World shifting in Prime 2 is essential to complete the game, as all the energy controllers are located in the Dark World, guarded by strong alien darkness. But I think I'm going to have to stop myself there though. This video is already long enough as it is, and if I continue any further, this is just going to turn into a review of Prime 2 at the end. So to sum it all up, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes is my absolute favorite Metroid game of all time. From its atmosphere, amazing music, which I didn't even cover here, memorable bosses, another thing I kind of skipped over, and the graphics that are just as stunning as its predecessor, Metroid Prime 2 is the pinnacle of Metroid games for me. Now let's just see and hope Metroid Prime 4 blows the rest of the Prime series out of the water, and even can dethrone what's considered my favorite Metroid game of all time. Alright, so this has literally been the longest scripted video I've ever made. As a message to my past self, I hope the literal several days worth of editing for this video was worth it. But anyway guys, thanks a million for watching this video all the way to the end. I couldn't be more grateful for your guys' continued support in these troubled times. It's thanks to you guys that I've been able to get the extra help I need to keep my house functional and running. I hope you have all an amazing day, and if you're new here, why not subscribe to my channel and leave a like on the video. Also, if you want to see more content from me, check down in the description for some of my videos playlists I've compiled over the past 5 years on YouTube. Click on the videos in the end slate too to check out more of my content. But that'll do it for me guys, don't want to take too much more of your time up. So thanks for watching, this has been ZDS, making YouTube fun one video at a time, and I will see you guys in the next video. Have a good night everybody, I love you all.